Today, talking to us, we've got Brian Richardson, which is the editor of Say It Loud that you can find at Books, and a long-term member of the SWP and also a very active anti-racism campaigner. So yeah, if you haven't been to a meeting before, the structure that we usually have is we give the speaker 30 minutes, followed by opening to the floor, and then we give the speaker an opportunity to come back in and answer any questions or reply to any comments. So yeah, if you want to go on.
Well, always slightly dangerous having clapping before you've heard. I hope you're clapping at the end. But seriously, good afternoon, everyone. It really is a pleasure to be, I say, amongst comrades and friends, some of whom I've known for a very long time, and it's good to see you again after not having been able to see you for nearly 3 years now. For those of you who've not been to Marxism Festival before and for whom it's your first time, welcome. I hope you're finding it interesting and enjoyable. Those of you who know me will know that I often like to start meetings. Can you hear this? Is it working? Yeah. I often like to start meetings by playing a piece of music, not simply to kind of get me in the mood myself, to kind of psych myself up. And neither do I simply choose a random piece of music, but instead I try to choose something that is relevant to the subject that we're going to discuss. And so the video that I chose to play, for those of you who arrived in good time, is a piece of music which really kind of summarises the reason why we haven't been able to gather in meeting rooms for so long. Firstly, of course, but also the one great thing that defied the pandemic. Of course, it was the global pandemic that is the reason why we haven't been able to meet in this way for over 2 years. But the great and extraordinary Black Lives Matter eruption in the wake of the murder of George Floyd by a police officer in Minneapolis in May 2020 was an eruption that defied the lockdown and literally brought millions of people right across the world out onto the streets in every single continent apart from Antarctica. So in case you didn't know, the video and the song are called Lockdown. It finishes with a whole series of names of people who died at the hands of the police, and it's by an artist called Anderson .Paak. One of the great highlights, and we're gonna, if you've got the video ready, one of the great highlights of that uprising was something that occurred on these shores when, as we can see here, and you can cheer this.
Is Jack recording the video?
So that is, of course, when activists in Bristol tore down the statue of the infamous slaveholder Edward Colston and hurled it into Bristol Harbour. Now, for my sins, I happen to be a criminal barrister. I usually keep that quiet at meetings like this. But, well, as some of you may know, that I and my learned friends have been on strike this day. And we will be again on Monday. So if you happen to live in London, or if you're still in London, please join us on what I'm not allowed to call is a picket line outside the Royal Courts of Justice on Monday. I digress slightly, but let me just say a couple more things about that particular episode. Firstly, it was absolutely fantastic to see a jury at Bristol Crown Court really defying the evidence before their own eyes and acquitting the people who were arrested and subsequently charged with causing criminal damage. I happen to be friends with the barristers who ran that case, and I'm extremely jealous of them for being given the brief to defend people in that trial. But more broadly and far more importantly, that act of defiance captured the imagination of people right around the world, including in America itself, where no less a figure than the Reverend Al Sharpton referred to that protest and that successful hurling of the statue at the funeral of George Floyd. It's an indication of the international dimension that the Black Lives Matter protests took. So, to come back to the title of this meeting, statues, monuments, memorials and buildings matter. They're not natural phenomena that happen to have got where they are by chance. Instead, they were commissioned, paid for and built by and for people with the influence and resources to put them there. And it flows from this, therefore, that their presence tells us something about who has power in society and the messages that they wish to convey. Now, don't just take my word for it. This very week, on Tuesday to be precise, the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act 2022 came into force. It's a particularly odious piece of legislation, which includes a number of utterly vile provisions, including many which I'm sure people at this event... Sorry?
It's quite quiet.
Many people at this event were involved in the protest when the bill was first introduced back in 2020. Indeed, amongst the worst of its provisions are powers for the police to limit and control demonstrations and criminalise people who participate in them. And those parts of that act were specifically introduced, and the then Metropolitan Police Commissioner Cressida Dick made no secret of this. They were introduced precisely because of the inspirational Extinction Rebellion protests in 2019 and Black Lives Matter in 2020. And let me just take a few minutes to quote the words of a circular that was published on Tuesday by the Ministry of Justice that is subtitled Criminal Damage to Memorials. It says, and I quote, "Demonstrations in the summer of 2020 by protesters targeting statues, including war memorials and other commemorations of cultural significance, caused great public concern. On the 7th of June 2020, remember this is less than 2 weeks after George Floyd's killing, during the anti-racism protests, the Cenotaph War Memorial in Whitehall was daubed with graffiti, and a protester tried to set fire to the Union Jack flag on the memorial. The statue of Winston Churchill in Westminster was also spray painted with the words, 'was a racist,' under the former Prime Minister's crossed out name. These attacks sparked significant interest in the topic in the House of Commons. It has long been considered that the law is not sufficiently robust in this area. Whilst instances of damage to and desecration of statues and war memorials are typically of low monetary value, they very often carry a high sentimental and emotional impact." On the 23rd of June, so again, just a few days later, MPs asked the government to support a new desecration of war memorials bill intended to introduce a new and specific offence. Their concern was that the maximum you could get is a £5,000 fine or perhaps 3 months imprisonment. As a result, and they said, right, that this does not reflect the severity of the crime or the distress caused to the public at large. As a result, the government decided to not concerned with the Black Lives Matter protests and the hurt caused and the anger that people were expressing, concerned with the hurt caused by the desecration to these memorials. The government decided to introduce, as part of the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, an amendment to the existing law. When the change is coming to enforce, this will ensure that where memorials are damaged or desecrated, the courts are able to sentence appropriately at every level for this type of offending. The full range of sentences means a maximum sentence of up to 10 years imprisonment. Now, I don't want to be accused of scaremongering. In reality, I'd be astonished if anyone were to be given a sentence anywhere close to 10 years. But the point is this, the important point is that even to think about sentences up to that level means that would be a sentence considerably higher than for many serious sexual offences. That is an indication of the attitude that this government has, and an indication of the context. Now, one of the crude accusations is made against people who campaign for the removal of these kind of statues commemorating Winston Churchill and the like, is that they're seeking to erase history. You may recall that in America, in the wake of the Black Lives Matter upsurges there, the then President Donald Trump signed an executive order which stated, and I quote, that anyone who damages a public statue must be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. And he went on, this is Donald Trump, went on to accuse protesters of a deep ignorance of our history. And similarly, back in 2017, when protesters were campaigning for the removal of the statues commemorating Confederate generals and the military figures who led the Southern armies to protect and preserve slavery, Trump tweeted, again I quote, "Sad to see the history and culture of our great country being ripped apart with the removal of our beautiful statues and monuments. You can't change history, but you can learn from it." And that declaration came at a time when the far right and fascists were gathering for so-called Unite the Right demonstrations to defend those statues. And the most infamous of those rallies occurred in Charlottesville, Virginia, when one of those fascists, one James Alex Field, used his car to mow down and murder the white anti-racist protester Heather Heyer. So the suggestion that people protesting about statues such as these are seeking to eradicate or erase history is, of course, errant nonsense. I mean, for one thing, and Nadia Ibrahim mentioned this in one of the earlier meetings, the idea that these are long-established monuments is a complete nonsense. Many of the statues of Confederate generals existed forever. They were erected in the aftermath of the Civil War, in the decades when there was a battle going on in the southern states to establish the Jim Crow system of segregation, when blacks, freed slaves and so on, were fighting to develop what then became the civil rights and black power movement. So this was an attempt to drive back the gains of the revolution, to drive back the gains that people were being made, and to cement a history of the rotten racist history. So I make no apology for repeating something that Yuri Prasad said in a meeting yesterday afternoon. Far from seeking to shut down a discussion or prevent discussion of history, what protesters are really demanding is a much wider discussion of history. I mean, I for one am happy to discuss Winston Churchill. Indeed, we provided an opportunity earlier today for some of you to hear Tariq Ali launching his book, Winston Churchill, His Times, His Crime. And that meeting. I wasn't able to go to it, but I'm sure Tariq didn't just talk about Churchill, the great war leader who saved Britain and indeed the world from fascism. If the quotes on the back of the book are anything to go by, he also mentioned Churchill saying, "I'm strongly in favour of using poison gas against uncivilised crimes. I hate people with slit eyes and pigtails. I don't like the look of them or the smell of them, but I suppose it does no great harm to have a look at them and keep England white." I'm sure that, I'm all for a discussion of that. I'm all for a discussion of Churchill's attitude towards Bengal Indians, who he was happy to see starved to death when there was a famine taking place. Similarly, I'm happy to have a discussion about Cecil Rhodes, and thank you to the comrade for giving me a copy of this pamphlet I hadn't seen before. The man whose name is used to fund prestigious scholarships to Oxford University, the man who bequeathed the land in Cape Town upon which the University of Cape Town is built, the man whose statue stares down from the facade of Oriel College in Oxford. I'm happy for a discussion that doesn't simply talk about the philanthropy of this great man, but also talks about the circumstances in which he gained that wealth in the first place. And it's when we raise that point that we get into the unavoidable and malign history of Britain and other empires. Of course, it used to be claimed, didn't it, that Britain had an empire upon which the sun would never set. Of course, the words of Rule Britannia, which I'm told is still sung full-throatedly at the last night of the proms, tells us that at heaven's command, Britain ruled the waves and that Britons will never be slaves. Well, again, Yuri discussed yesterday how all manner of ideological arguments have been used to justify slavery, the empire, and so on. That heaven's command, it was God's will that Britain had an empire, that slavery was not such a bad thing because slaves were not really humans, that they were not deserving, therefore, of the rights of man. And it was just the rights of men, not of women, at the time when these great liberal ideas were being discussed, and science being invoked to claim that these people were naturally, biologically and intellectually inferior, and that this therefore justified the subordination of people with black and brown skins. Well, those were some of the ideas that dominated empire at its height. Well, sadly, of course, for the rulers of great empires like Britain, in the aftermath of the Second World War, that empire did crumble as the jewel in its crown, India, as Caribbean colonies, African colonies and others gained their independence, and others, the United States primarily, superseded Britain as the world's dominant power. The pretense remained, however, that Britain made a great contribution to world civilization, and indeed that it still does. So you see, for example, the tour that the future King William and his wife took to the Caribbean earlier this year. I'm reliably told that when they've fallen out of favour now, so we don't really talk about them, but when Harry and Meghan got married a few years ago, we were delightfully told that the tiara that Meghan wore had a flower from every country in the Commonwealth to symbolise the unity of the Commonwealth, and how Britain still played this progressive role in bringing people together. That, our rulers would have us believe that there was just this smooth transition from empire to Commonwealth, so much so that countries proudly retained the Queen as head of state, and retained the House of Lords as it was then, the Supreme Court as it is now, as the final arbiter of the law. Now, some of us, myself included, have parents who came from Caribbean islands and were told they were British citizens, and that Britain was the mother country which would provide them with protection and prosperity. Well, I'll come back to that. But let's pause to consider this. The very reason why people from, as they were called, the Windrush generation, came from the Caribbean was because, and therefore were part of the British Empire, was because, well, they came to Britain in the first place because the islands that they came from had been looted of their wealth and resources in the first place by Britain, so they couldn't really make a living in those islands. And of course, many millions of those people who in times past lived, died and toiled in those places did so because they had been captured during the transatlantic slave trade in the first place and transported to those islands in order to create the wealth that built the modern prosperity of countries like Britain in the first place. And so, as the title of this talk indicates, a true study of the history of countries like Britain cannot escape consideration not just of empire, but of slavery as well. And as the Trinidadian writer and later Prime Minister Eric Williams writes in his outstanding study, Capitalism and Slavery, and that's the title of his book, Capitalism and Slavery, go hand in hand. It was slavery that quite literally built the mid-modern world, the capitalist world in which we live in. And I'm sure I don't need to tell people in this room or at this festival just how brutal slavery was. When I was growing up, one of the greatest influences on me was a television series called Roots, which told the story of Kunta Kinte, a slave who was stolen from Gambia and transported to the United States, and his struggle and that of his family to fight back against slavery. I've just read a very interesting book called The Interest, a subtitle, How the British Establishment Resisted the Abolition of Slavery, by a guy called Michael Taylor, not a revolutionary socialist, but I think he works in the city, actually. But in that book, he charts the history of places like Demerara and Jamaica and shows how the wealth of cities such as London, Bristol, Cardiff, Norwich, Kingston upon Hull, Newcastle, Glasgow, Aberdeen, Inverness were built, and you could go on to mention numerous others, Edinburgh, Liverpool, Manchester and so on. Look around almost any major city and you'll see the long-established companies, banks, building societies, insurance companies and so on, who established their wealth quite literally on the backs of slaves. So, for example, Jamaica, Taylor suggests that for almost 200 years, the largest and most valuable slave colony in the British Empire was Jamaica. And he goes on to say that by the early 19th century, there were more enslaved people in Jamaica, over 300,000, than there were people of any description in any British city except London. That's how deep-rooted it was, and people will have seen the horrific images of slave ships. When I was growing up, there's an album by Bob Marley called Survival, which has a very famous image of a slave ship that shows how people were crammed in to these airtight holds, unable to gain any decent air and so on. You will have seen TV series like Roots, which was remade in 2016. Steven Spielberg's film Amistad, Steve McQueen's 12 Years a Slave. Films and series which show the utterly brutal treatment that people received during when they were captured, during the Middle Passage, when they were transported to the islands where they were forced to work. I mean, talking of Jamaica, a student of Jamaican history, Leonard Barnett, he he says, that it lacked any vestige of humanity. A handful of greedy planters held absolute power over thousands of slaves, and only through violence could such complete domination by a minority be initiated and perpetuated. And again, those films and TV series shows the utterly relentless way in which people were forced to work. They were whipped, they were hung out in the burning sun, treated with all manner of privations for insubordination, the sexual exploitation of women, and so on. And so, when we talk about decolonising history in the curriculum, what most of us are saying is not that we don't want to discuss this, despite the anguish that it causes us, but that we want to discuss the real history of capitalism read in tooth and claw. But what we also say, of course, is not just we want to discuss the rotten history of capitalism and the rotten influence of people like Churchill and Cecil Rhodes and Colston and so on, but we also say that we want to discuss history from below, because we know that those who suffered and were subjected to slavery and brutality didn't simply suffer and tolerate it as, or even think it was a good thing, as some of its proponents would have us believe, but rather they fought relentlessly against it. The great Trinidadian Marxist C.L.R. James, who dedicated his life to unearthing, exploring and discussing these struggles, it said, and I quote, and please excuse me for using the language of the time, that the docile Negro is a myth. The only place where Negro revolts did not take place was in the pages of capitalist historians. The Negro's revolution, history of revolution is rich, inspiring and unknown. And we therefore want to make sure that it is known by ensuring that it is part of the curriculum. That's why the likes of C.L.R. James wrote his masterpiece, The Black Jacobins, about the great Haitian Revolution of the 18th and early 19th centuries. And it's precisely because people thought that slavery, in the first instance, was brought crumbling down, and the facade of empire as well. We want to smash the top-down view, great man approach to history, the idea that it was simply because of William Wilberforce in Britain, or Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator in America, that slavery was brought to an end. We want to ensure that the real history from below is part of the discussion as well. I'm running out of time, but I want to also say that one of the other things that Taylor does very well in The Interest is show, as I say, not just how organised and determined the British establishment was to resist slavery. They weren't able to do that. But they were able to ensure that when slavery came to an end, it wasn't the slaves who were compensated, but in fact the slave owners, including for the loss of 202 slaves, one Sir James Duff, who is the first cousin 6 times removed of one David Cameron.
1 minute.
I'm going to need more than 1 minute.
I'll give you 5. I'll give you 5, but I'll give you another 1 minute warning.
Okay. Let me come on to David Cameron then, because back in 2015, the then Prime Minister made a highly publicised trip to Jamaica. Now, earlier that year, Jamaica's Parliament had, in fact, passed a motion that stated that he was entitled not just to apologies, but to reparations. And there were calls by, amongst others, the Barbadian historian Sir Hilary Beckles for serious investment by Britain to rehabilitate and renew the infrastructure of Caribbean islands. And therefore, when he went to Jamaica, Cameron was under a certain amount of pressure to not simply issue an apology for the slave trade. In the event, there was no atonement whatsoever. Instead, he talked, no apology, about the supposedly shared proud history of Britain and Jamaica. And what investment he did talk about was to enable the building of a new prison, which would allow for the deportation of so-called Jamaican nationals who had been convicted of crimes in Britain. And that utterly rotten intervention coincided with what became known as the Windrush scandal. I mean, I talked earlier about my mother coming to what was called the mother country, as it was known. As the Guardian journalist Amelia Gentleman and others have exposed in her brilliant book, The Windrush Betrayal, what we now know, of course, is that many thousands of people who thought that they were British citizens, with all the benefits that should entitle them to work and pensions, healthcare and so on, were not just denied all of that, but were in some cases deported to countries that they had not set foot in since they were children. It really does expose the continuing rotten racism of the British state. Let me come on to, therefore, the question of reparations, because the argument that people like Hilary Beckles were putting was about it's not actually the argument about reparations. It's not a new one. There have been, long established calls for reparations. But as I say, there were reparations in the 19th century, but the reparations weren't to the slaves. Instead, some £20 million, which David Olusoga points out was 40% of the British annual budget at the time, was given to the slave owners. A bigger bailout than anything until the 2009 financial crash. And the final payment of those reparations was not made until 2015. Absolutely. I mean, so the argument isn't a new one. More recently, we've heard, it's been raised for a long time by people in Congress. It's raised every year. There's a bill since 1989. It's got nowhere. When she made her maiden speech in the House of Commons, my MP, Bel Ribeiro Addy, who is of Ghanaian origin, intervened in a debate about global Britain to talk about reparations. But that's one of the few times it's got a hearing in Britain. Where I live in Brixton, there's an annual march around reparations. Frankly, only a few dozen people have tended to go on it. Activists in the RMP have regularly held a reparations conference, but until the last couple of years, little traction. What I think has catapulted it back into people's imagination has been the Black Lives Matter movement over the last couple of years. Has really thrown it back onto the agenda, and that's I hope, therefore, that, for example, I know that comrades who have been involved in the campaign around the Jeffrey statue in Hackney will talk about that. I don't know if anyone from Dorset is here, but they can talk about the man who is the richest member of the House of Commons, Richard Drax, or to give him his full name, Richard Grosvenor Plunkett Ernley Earl Drax, Conservative MP for South Dorset, one of whose most recent interventions is to attack the windfall tax as red meat to socialists. The reason he's the richest MP is because his family's wealth was derived from the Drax Hall sugar plantations in Barbados. You know where that came from. And he continues to have and to earn money from those estates. So I'm quite happy for us to talk about reparations against those people. I'm quite happy to talk about reparations against the likes of David Cameron. I need to wind up, so what I'm going to do therefore is just say that I think the argument that the wealth should be taken from the rich and powerful and redistributed more fairly and equally to those who've created the wealth is ABC. It should be ABC for those of us who are socialists. The more complicated question, and therefore the one I'm going to end on, in terms of my introduction, and throw it out for you to consider, is how, concretely, do we bring that kind of redistribution about? Okay, over to you.
Okay, I haven't got much time, but I just want to say a few words about France, where I live. And the tearing down of the Corston statue was headline news in France. Yeah. And this, of course, was because it touched a raw nerve, because France was, one of the most important slave trading countries and had the second biggest colonial empire in the world. So obviously, there has been a whole debate about this, and it has started small victories. There's actually a new statue in Paris, which has been, I don't know, it's put up about 2 weeks ago, which is a statue of Solitude. Solitude was a pregnant slave who fought against the restoration of slavery in 1802 by Napoleon, and was a martyr. And there's now a statue in Paris to her memory. So there are also progressive statues. This is a small symbolic victory, and it's also a very tokenistic gesture by the mayor of Paris. I mean, I don't overestimate it. It's important. France, of course, is the most progressive nation in Europe, as everyone knows. It's the only country in the world to have abolished slavery, not just once, but twice. And why twice? Because slavery was restored in 1802 by Napoleon. Now, this, as a historical fact, was totally ignored and forgotten until a few years ago, and it took the work of radical historians, black historians, and so on, to kind of make people realise that Napoleon actually was responsible for restoring slavery. And even today, there are tributes and speeches and documentaries about Napoleon, this great French figure, great figure of French history, in which this fact is not even mentioned. So it is an ongoing struggle to actually talk about history in a meaningful way, and to counter the narrative which has held sway for so many years. I've just finished with a very recent event which a lot of people found very shocking. As you know, we've had elections in France, and the most significant aspect of these elections, of course, was the election of 89 fascist MPs. Yeah. Now, last week was the official opening of the new parliament. And there's a tradition in France that the first session of the parliament is opened by a speech by the oldest MP. The oldest MP happens to be a member of Le Pen's Rassemblement National. And he made a speech in which he actually justified French colonialism in Algeria, defended the record of the OAS, which was a right-wing terrorist organisation formed by European settlers in Algeria, and generals who actually plotted against and tried to kill de Gaulle because he granted independence to Algeria. So we had an MP actually justifying this from the tribune of the Parliament. And actually, what left-wing MPs should have done was to walk out. Yeah. But they didn't. No. They didn't. So I think that this shows that it's an ongoing battle. We win victories, sometimes small victories, but we have to be vigilant all the time because history can also go in the other direction.
Thank you for that. That right?
Okay, thank you, comrades. I live in Hackney, and as Brian said, we've been fighting a campaign for 2 years now to bring down the statue of a slaver, 17th century slaver, Robert Jeffrey, from a plinth over the Museum of the Home. This wasn't started by us. This wasn't a campaign we started because there's lots of things going on. We've been fighting for refugees and fighting against this racist government. What happened when Colston fell in June 2002 is that the trustees of the museum said, oh, shit, we've got a slaver above our door as well. And they opened up a consultation as to what should be done with it. They their own consultation came back saying that 70% of the people of Hackney want it brought down. Not necessarily destroyed. We want to actually, it's a museum. It should be put in the museum, and the role of this man should be explained. Because the thing is, Museum of the Home has been around, I think, since 1914. Generations of school kids have gone there. Generations of black school kids have gone there. And generations of school kids have not been told that Geoffrey wasn't just a philanthropist, because the actual house, the housing of the museum is in essentially it's a place for pensioners who worked in the iron trade, where he also made his money. But he actually got the majority of his money from slavery. He owned a ship called the China Merchant. He was a director of the Royal Africa Company that dealt in slaves. Most people who went into that museum were never told that, including our MP, Diane Abbott, the first black MP ever elected, went there as a school kid. Nobody told her that Geoffrey was a bloody slaver. There have been 5 books written about Geoffrey up until this year. They're all in the museum, you can buy them. Most of them don't tell you that he was a slaver. One of them sort of says he was, but it's like, well, he did lots of other things, didn't he? Anyway, let's go on to talk about what a philanthropist he was. This characterises the whole approach of the British establishment to their statues, the statues to evil men, and the fact that they made their money from blood and exploitation and whatever. And they also hide another aspect of history, because we've been attacked for wanting to cancel culture and cancel history and whatever. The fight by ordinary working class people from the 1700s onwards, for over the 400 years that the British carried out the North Atlantic slave trade, was resisted en masse by working class people. That's hardly ever mentioned either. That kind of grassroots unity with ordinary people. Now, as a result, we've decided to write our own pamphlet about Robert Geoffrey's life, and the chair was waving it in the corner, and I hope you go to Bookmarks and buy it. And if you're teachers or involved in education, please think seriously about buying this in bulk and getting it out there, because it's a great history, not just of one man and one man's role, but actually how that was knitted right into the British bourgeoisie at the point of the bourgeois revolution, that there is no aspect of the British establishment that is not soaked in the blood of slaves.
Sorry,
and
I'm
actually,
gonna have to ask you
I will do. I'm sorry. So please buy it. Keep it up. Geoffrey will fall. Despite the defence of the Tories and the rest of it, all the slavers will fall. It's our duty to do it. It's not just symbolism. It is. That is their history. Our history is resistance to slavery.
Green trousers, cool. Followed by you right at the back. Yeah.
Hi.
And if you do want to put your hands up, I'll keep an eye out. Correct.
Hi there. I'm Eva. I'm from Portugal originally, and now. And Portugal tries to hide its colonial history to everyone else apart from the people who live in Portugal. And sadly, Portugal has a very recent colonial history. Our last colony was lost in 1974 when the revolution in Portugal took place, and there was a series of colonial wars, and Mozambique and Angola and São Tomé and Príncipe, all these places got their independence after brutal independence wars, and basically civil wars previously. And the thing is that the majority of working class people in the 70s and in the 60s was greatly opposed to the war, despite the fact that thousands and thousands of young men were being taken to these foreign places, dying of horrible conditions, having to kill teenagers and children that they didn't want to kill, and running away from home. And yet, the upper classes continue to push this doctrine that we must keep the ultramar, we must keep the massive lands that we have abroad, and we must keep not directly enslaving people, but basically exploiting the country since we have done from the 1500s onwards. But the problem is when you bring up this conversation now, and even within universities, I studied a year of history at Lisbon Uni. When you bring up the conversation of completely changing the doctrine around and the discourse around slavery and around what we call the discoveries, because we want to make it sound cool and not like colonialism. When you bring that topic up, people become incredibly offended because that's still is perceived by many, including the academic establishment, as the golden age of Portugal, as the time where Portugal was grand, like a pinnacle of Portuguese history. To the point that when the dictatorship took place, there was a massive revivalism of the maritime expansion times, and all of these monumental, in scale, I mean, not in importance, but these monumental monuments were built praising thousands or hundreds of colonizers, like Vasco da Gama, like Pedro Álvares Cabral, that I know about. Many of you probably won't, it doesn't matter. But we keep praising them in Portuguese history, and it's very difficult to try and get it to the people whose parents fought in the colonial wars in the 70s, people whose parents fought against it, people whose parents were for the revolution. It's very difficult for them to understand how this colonial past is so damaging, and it's praising so many centuries of violence. So, sorry.
1 minute.
1 minute, great. I'll sum up. So basically what I'm saying is that this is not purely a British issue, it's not purely an American issue. It's a constant European issue that has to be, and a Western issue that has to be constantly fought against and reminded of, because even people that are well-natured and mean well and are generally good people and generally care about equal rights don't understand how damaging our past can be and how it perpetuates discrimination and violence nowadays.
That was exactly perfect timing. We're going to go all the way to the back for the name tag. Cool.
Hi, I want to bring another aspect to this discussion, move on from statues to talk about streets, road names. I live in Tottenham, and there's a major thoroughfare in Tottenham, a major road called Black Boy Lane. Is a road in Tottenham, a road that takes its name from a pub called The Black Boy, a pub which if you've read Peter Fryer's great work about staying power, the history of Black people in Britain, lots and lots of slave owners had public houses called The Black Boy. This particular pub in Tottenham had, the sign hanging outside it was the most gross, offensive, stereotypical caricature of an African man. Mm-hmm. Those of you old enough who remember on Jars of Marmalade, excuse me for saying the word, gollywog, that's what this caricature looked like. The pub is gone. A great campaigner from the area, Martha Osmore, fought to have the pub shut down. The pub is still shut to this day. The sign is gone. The road is still there. And for the last 2.5 years, those of us in Harrogate Standard to raise them, we've been trying to get that road name changed. We have fought a council over and over again. We've been to a full council meeting, 3 meetings of the corporate committee. We finally got a decision to change that street name to commemorate, rather than commemorating that pub and what it represents, to get it changed to represent a prominent black member of the society, and the name's gone right out of my head, excuse me. The reason I'm bringing this up is because unlike the issue with the Jeffrey Museum, where it's a struggle where the government are directly taking a hand in, this is a Labour council. The issue of renaming Black Boy Lane has become a political football between two different factions within the ruling Labour Party in Harrogate. There's been a change of leadership, and what they want to do is kick it into the long grass. So now it's part of a review, and it's now going to be put off until at least January next year when they actually enact a decision that's already been made. I was there at the corporate committee where they made that decision. I spoke at that. They got one of their side, the other side of this argument, who had no right to speak at that committee, to come and denounce the idea that we were putting forward that this road should be renamed. So this is an issue that for me and for us in Harrogate, for those of us in Tottenham who fight against racism, that it exposes the fact that even in a party that's supposedly on our side, and there are several members of Harrogate Labour Party who work with standard racism, it becomes an issue, it stops becoming an issue of principle and becomes an issue of political expediency. That's the fight that we've had for the last 2.5 years, but I think we've won. I think by January next year, that name will be changed.
Thank you so much for that, comrade. Also exactly on time. And I have noted the few people that have put their hands up, and I will come to you as well. I think this is the perfect time for me to interject. Chairs aren't supposed to be contributing, but I want to make a contribution because I feel like this is something I want to contribute on. But yeah, no, for sure. Well, you were talking about Black Boy Lane, is that what you said? So I have been studying in Bristol the last 4 years, and I'm living on White Ladies Road. And on top of White Ladies Road, which is kind of half steep, you have Black Boy Hill. And naive me when I started in first year thought that maybe it had nothing to do with slavery or, you know, the actual words that were in there, but it definitely does. And like the more I was there, the more I realized like the attachment that Bristol had to slavery, their slave ports being the closest, you know, southwest. Yeah. Southwest. But also what Brian was talking about in like the resistance against taking down statues, only being in Bristol for 4 years, it was really obvious from the second I stepped there that the community wasn't comfortable with the street names and the placards and the statues and the university buildings. And one thing that I always hear from, so I'm just making sure I time myself. One thing I always hear from like the far right is, you know, not even the far right, like, you know, people that are central, is why didn't you do it democratically? Why didn't you go through your councillors? Why didn't you, like, you know, if you said we would listen. 4 years I've been there and people have been screaming and shouting, have petitions, have protests, and no one was listening. So it just got to the point where I think you guys need to remember that the BLM movement, this last BLM movement happened at the height of the pandemic. We didn't want to leave our houses. We were terrified of COVID at that point. Right now we're just walking around. I mean, I'm not masked right now. It's like, if I catch COVID. But back then it was like during the time where everyone was terrified. And so we made the active decision to go out on the streets and be in a crowd because of the fact that we were beyond frustrated. And America is not an exception. Hearing about the police in Cardiff was horrendous, and Cardiff's only like half an hour away from Bristol. And it's just a thing where you just take a step back and you're like, I didn't think that police forces would be that racist. My parents always taught me to have trust in them. Anyway, the last thing I'm going to mention before my time is up is the Colston 4. They were acquitted, is that the right word? Yes, which was amazing. But I found it really interesting that the 4 people on trial were white because you've got plenty of videos, as shown earlier, about tearing down the statue. You can see that the whole community, all of Bristol came out. And so it was a very strategic thing. And so I was thinking, 4 white people on trial, you're probably gonna lock them up. And then they were also acquitted on top of being white, which is amazing. But it just also has a lot to say about the motivation or why those people are on trial, or like why they didn't decide to put 4 black people on trial that were also equally as responsible for taking down that statue. I think personally Bristol as a whole was responsible for taking down that statue, and no regrets, because we've asked the council. It was very, very, very ridiculous. It was disrespectful to a lot of the Bristolian community, and so I'm very happy that no one got charged for that. I'm going to end it there, and I do have other contributions. So next one is you. Yes.
Hi everyone, my name is Jessica. I'm from Brazil. I don't want to get emotional, but George Floyd's death was very important for us too, because we protested a lot in Brazil. But apparently doesn't lead to anything there, because I don't know if you know, but Brazil is a country with half of the population, more than half of the population is black or indigenous, but we have mass killings of Black and Indigenous people every day. But even so, we protested for George and for other people that were killed just right before him in Brazil. But exactly 2 years after, Genivaldo de Jesus, a Brazilian guy with schizophrenia, was riding his motorcycle without a helmet. So the police pulled him over, put him in the back of a trunk, dropped a gas bomb there, and let them die. And unfortunately, didn't come to the international media that much. So less than 2 weeks before that, we had the death, the killing, the murder of 2 brave people, Bruno Pereira and Dom Phillips, the British journalist. Bruno Pereira, the indigenous Brazilian. And now we're protesting in Brazil because of these 2 deaths. And what I wanted to ask you is to protest with us, because our voice is not being heard enough. So please protest with us. We have the chance, we may have the chance to win this year. We have it's election year in Brazil, and we have like the ex-former president Lula. He's stopping the race, but Bolsonaro, our current president, genocide president, he's gonna play dirty. So I ask you, please protest with us. Let's make this a little bit better. Thank you.
For us, do you know if there's anything happening in London so
Not
far?
yet,
But we'll show solidarity.
everyone
with
who wants can come and talk to me, and we can arrange something.
Cool. Thanks for that. I want to go.
I just wanted to say that we have to realise that slavery is still an existing issue. The biggest issue today is neocolonialism, and obviously that was coined by Kwame Nkrumah, the first president and prime minister of Ghana. There was also something that I wanted to raise an issue about, and it's to do with Rwanda. And obviously a lot of you are talking about the British, the deportations to Rwanda. But what I haven't heard about any of you talking about, and probably because, news about Africa is hardly in the mainstream, it's about the war that Rwanda is waging in eastern DR Congo. So Rwanda is ruled by Paul Kagame, who's a Tutsi, and he's committing a genocide in eastern DR Congo. This war actually stems back to late 90s. So Western powers, they're also complicit in this genocide, as they are giving financial aid to Rwanda's military to commit massacres in the Kivu region of DR Congo. Uganda is also involved in this conflict, as they are allied with Rwanda. Rwanda is funding rebels in DR Congo, looting resources for the West. Now, DR Congo is like probably the most exploited country, African country, because it's rich in a wide range of natural resources. One of them is coltan, and coltan is a prominent material used in our electric devices. So back in May 31st, 2022, Rwanda announced their invasion, which they've already invaded, so I don't really know why they're saying that. So so the Kivu conflict is part of 3 phases: 2004 to 2009, 2012 to 2013, and the current phase from 2017. So other neighboring provinces are also being affected in DR Congo. On May 31st, Kagame announced the invasion, with strengthening the Tutsi militia M23, which comes as the militia recently mobilized for the first time in 9 years. Recently, Rwanda soldiers have been captured by armed forces, but there is still, basically the Hutu nationalists and Tutsi nationalists are reuniting, but only to commit genocide in DR Congo. there is also a prominent rebel leader against Rwanda called William Yakatunga. And so basically he's leading forces against Rwanda with the Mai Mai militias, which are militias, community-based Congolese militias to defend against Rwanda. And last thing I just want to say is that in DR Congo, 48 women are raped every hour. Millions are displaced, many are killed. So a few things that you can follow is the atlasnews.co and also Renegade Journal, and also an Instagram account that updates is called Yakutumism, YAKUTUMBISM on Instagram. That's all I have to say.
Thank you so much. Really glad you mentioned that. Actually, I was talking to someone about that earlier.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
When the COVID pandemic started, as you said, it coincided with the BLM protest. I was actually persuaded for some reason that the reason why we had the lockdown was because of the BLM, because this was actually for some reason I felt this was like a black revolution, right? But then later on, after the COVID pandemic set in, I said no, that was wishful thinking. But then again, previous to them telling us all to wear face masks, research had been done that said that face masks weren't effective. So I'm still persuaded that that was the Black Revolution was hijacked. You may call that a conspiracy theory, but I'm sure there are researchers who can look into this, because because in the first place the COVID itself was I like to call it an advanced version of the flu, and it was not as serious as if you have a weak immune system, it attacks you, right? Now, secondly, I just want to talk about the reparations. Who is going to pay reparations? And if they do decide to pay reparations, as we know, the Windrush compensation, a lot of people have died without getting compensation. So if they do decide to award compensation, are people going to get it? When are they going to get it? And who is going to get it? And if it's individuals, okay. If it's countries, we know that these countries are as corrupt as the neocolonial masters in Washington, Paris, Lisbon, or wherever. So are the reparation monies going to go to the people that it should be going to? Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for keeping it short and precise. Okay, I'm going to hand back to Brian. I'm going to give you 10 minutes and we're going to be strict because, I've got to finish, but cool.
Okay, well, first of all, I'm sorry that other people didn't get an opportunity to contribute, but please, hang around and we can carry on the discussion. Just on the point about Rwanda, unfortunately, there are only so many meetings that we can have here at Marxism. We would love to discuss and debate other topics, including that particularly important one. Just to say, it's not that we haven't discussed it at all. Certainly, for those of you who went to Yuri Prasad's meeting yesterday, and there was by the way, I'm an Arsenal fan, and it is a huge embarrassment to me that Arsenal has got to visit Rwanda and take sponsorship money from the Rwandan government. That's an absolute disgrace. But Yuri made a brief reference to Paul Kagame and the fact that what that highlights, because the question was raised about whether African leaders are simply doing their master's bidding. And actually, he chose the example of Paul Kagame to highlight the fact that it isn't simply the case that people like him are doing their master's bidding. Actually, what you have is a ruling class. They don't have, the power, the global power and influence of America or Russia or China or Britain or whatever. But you have ruling classes in countries like Rwanda or South Africa or Zimbabwe or Nigeria who have their own interests, who want to maintain their power and will use the same kinds of means of divide and rule, of conquering other lands and so on, that they learned those lessons from their colonial masters and they try and implement it on a local level. That helps to explain why Paul Kagame, rather than being a friend and ally of black oppressed and exploited people around the world is trying to exploit and oppress black people both in his country and in neighbouring countries by prosecuting wars and things like that. I don't I mean, on the COVID thing, the 2020 Black Lives Matter upsurge, of course, happened after George Floyd was murdered on the 25th of May. We were already 3 months into the lockdown by that stage because COVID-19 is a real thing. I know, for example, that friends and comrades of mine who would have been at Marxism 2020 and 2021 are not here at Marxism 2022 because some of them are dead and have died because of COVID. Others are not here because they're suffering now because of the pandemic. It is a real thing. And actually one of the questions that we should be considering is the way in which the most advanced society that we have lived under, capitalism, creates these kinds of disgraceful and disgusting pandemics that destroys the lives of literally millions of people all around the globe. But I want to really, because I don't have that much time, is to pick up on, I think, what was the first contribution, which talked about small victories and progressive statues, because that is the case, and it's very important that we think about those things. I talked about living in Brixton. Now, and I think one of the brilliant things about the Black Lives Matter upsurge is that we have won some small but important victories. The most important, of course, was the conviction of Derek Chauvin for George Floyd's murder. That wouldn't have happened 25, 30 years ago when atrocities like the beating of Rodney King were broadcast around the world, but the police officers responsible did not get convicted. That George Floyd was convicted, I think, because the upsurge was so great that he had to be tried in the first place, and the jury felt that they had to convict him. That, I think, is an important victory, and it's important that we acknowledge and recognise that we have victories along the way. And again, one of the brilliant things about Black Lives Matter is I think that it has not just won some small victories, it has generated new debates and discussions. As I say, I live in Brixton. Now, and actually when I first moved to Brixton in the early 90s, I think the pub that my branch of the Socialist Workers' Party met in was called the George Canning. George Canning, for those of you who don't know, was one of the most important politicians of the early 19th century. He was the Foreign Secretary, and he was the lead figure in opposing the abolition of the slave trade. The pub's not called the George Canning anymore. That happened quite a while ago, but still, that road, that leads up to Tulse Hill. Tulse Hill is one of the closest parts of Brixton to where I live. Tulse Hill is named after Sir Henry Tulse. Sir Henry Tulse, a sugar magnate, I don't need to tell you where his fortune was made. But, we have contestation of these things, and so every day when I travel into work, I travel past, there's a library, that's the Tate Library. I don't need to tell you where Tate made his fortune from. But actually, since 1998, the public space outside the Tate Library in Brixton has been known as Windrush Square. Named after the generation of people who first came over 50 years previously and pioneered the establishment really of what is considered modern multicultural Britain. Not just that, but since 2014, in the corner of Windrush Square, just down along from the Tate Library, is the home of the Black Cultural Archives, which hosts a whole number of important artefacts commemorating the contribution that black people have made to British society. And since April of last year, April 2021, there is a monument to Cherry Gross, a black woman who was paralysed by the police in 1985 and who died. Didn't die until I think it was 2011, but died as a result of the injuries that she had suffered so long ago. it is an enormous, it must be, for me, it's an enormous sense of pride that the battles and struggles that we have fought have ensured that we have those monuments and that we do have some progressive statues. It shows how we can fight, how we can win some victories, pulling down Colston, pulling down Jeffrey, a victory against Drax. These will be important, will give us a sense of pride. However, what's the flip side? The flip side is when I get onto the tube at Brixton Station and I go to work in the criminal courts around the country, I am much more likely to be representing someone who is poor, black, marginalised. I cannot remember the last time one of my clients had not been excluded from school, and therefore the very reason they're out on the streets and more likely to fall under the tender mercies of the police and the criminal justice system. Why is that? Because for all that we have fought for and won, small victories over the decades and centuries, we haven't eradicated a system that creates and relies upon racism in the first place, that is so deeply embedded in the structures of society, a society that needs to divide and rule in order for the rich and powerful to maintain their power. It necessarily relies upon racism, and that explains things like the backlash, why the government introduced that legislation that I talked about in the Police Crime and Sentencing Act, why they're scapegoating people, refugees and asylum, a few hundred people coming to this country, and they want to charter flights and give £100 million to the Rwandan government to take these people. This is about scapegoating. This isn't, some kind of economically sound policy. It's about scapegoating because of their need to rely upon racism, and therefore, yes, we can and must fight for and gain those small victories, and we should celebrate those victories when we achieve them. But we need to go much further than that, and that, in a sense, actually brings me on to the question of reparations. Because as I say, of course, as a socialist, I'm all for the wealth that has been stolen from people being returned to the people. But if we think that we can just have a debate in the House of Commons or in Congress about reparations and that governments will agree, and that the rich and powerful will say, okay, fair enough, where do I need to give the money to? It ain't going to happen, is it? We know it's not going to happen, and therefore I have huge sympathy with the arguments about reparations, and think, and that, would support people who are calling for reparations. Concretely, it's brilliant in Dorset that there is a campaign about Drax and exposes the hypocrisy of, as I say, the richest member of the House of Commons, an utter scumbag who protects and preserves his wealth on the backs of people in Barbados. Of course we should expose those things and demand reparations, but actually if we think that it's simply going to be handed over to us, then really we're not being realistic. We know the rich and the powerful will use everything in their power. They'll use the education system to educate us to know our place. They'll use laws that they create, they debate and set up in the Houses of Parliament and other legislatures in order to cement their position in society. They'll use the police, they will use the military to batter and beat us and to try and make us submit. We have to use what power we have to challenge, defeat and overturn them. And that's why, yes, let's celebrate our victories. Yes, let's fight in the here and now for, and let's celebrate reforms and victories when we get them. But actually, ultimately, the only way in which we will get rid of racism, exploitation and oppression, lock, stock and barrel, is by a revolutionary transformation of society. And therefore, as well as celebrating, and I absolutely celebrate, it was apart from the birth of my daughter, but that's a personal thing, Black Lives Matter is the best thing that has happened to me in the last couple of years. But we need, as the great Angela Davis said, to ensure that it wasn't just an exhilarating moment, but it's a movement for lasting change. And I think if we want to talk about a movement for lasting change, we need to talk about a revolutionary transformation of society, and therefore what we need in terms of organising our class, orientating upon where we have our greatest power amongst the organised working class, black, white, young, old, gay, straight, whatever, in every area, in every community, organising that power is ultimately the way in which we will achieve the liberation that we're all striving for and we all want to see happen.